So we'll just have a kind of 15, 20-minute chat based on your presentations that you've just given to us now. Like I was saying before the break, they've really overlaid nicely. So I was writing down questions while they were going on. And for Paul's talk, I was like, oh, okay, what practical things might we do to kind of increase the profile of science and the kind of engagement of science in the church? And then Rachel stood up and answered that. So thank you, Rachel. But that I think there's still more that could be unpacked maybe there. So those, you see, it's very practical suggestions and the kind of subtle things we can do. Are there less subtle things we can do to maybe help church leadership to integrate science more fully into kind of Christian teaching? Does anyone want to comment on that?
Can I comment on something else? Can you hear me?
You are the chair, yes.
I think that before you discuss that, it's important to realize the context. And over the last 4 or 5 years of thinking about this issue and trying to get the church engaged with science, I've come to see that, if I didn't know it before, science and faith is not the church's #1 priority. People are more concerned about the cost of living at the moment. People are struggling with family problems and social issues, personal problems and so on. That this kind of quasi-academic problem is in the background. And for that reason, ministers in particular just don't have time to devote to it, really, because they're very busy putting out fires in their congregations and helping people and pastorally preparing their sermons and so on. So we've got to realize the context in which we're trying to get this message across. And the first thing, I think a lot of ministers realize it is an issue, but there are more important ones for them at the moment. And they haven't quite made the connection that if actually we can address this, it might help some of the other things. But if we can break down that barrier for people out there, that they start to come to church and give us a hearing, that actually might be beneficial for the church more generally. But it takes a leap of faith, to take that step, say, okay, is it worth investing my time and energy or people in the church's energy to do that? Because the payoff will not be very quick. It'll take a long time for that to develop.
And I pick up, just to pick up on both those points there, really. One of the things we are very much seeing, not only in the churches, but I also would argue in the education sector, is a lack of engagement. And I think that's probably one area we need to tackle. And I think much like traditional education model is a professor, a teacher, somebody stood up at the front of the room talking at people. And there's less possibility there for that interactive engagement element. And we're starting to try new methods with education, in particular, in more formal education. But we see this when we look at other populations who don't have formal education, but yet are thriving. And I think from that is perhaps also within the church, maybe we need to look at our model of delivery, or rather than it being somebody in a vicar, a minister in a pulpit talking at people, is actually practicing more of those Jesus principles of being the hands and feet, like you were saying previously about being like, we're right here, we are working, we are in these areas, and also engaging with people in their level of need. And I think we're all slightly guilty of this. You meet somebody, you're like, hi, how are you? You're not necessarily interested in how actually they are. It's just more of a welcome statement. And I think more going to people at their need when we are especially in such a needy time.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. And I think, as you say, churches do have a lot of very important things that they're dealing with at the moment. And so I wouldn't ever expect our local church, for example, to have a whole sermon or a series or anything on this, but dropping little bits in there. The little drops, I think, are very helpful. I also think that for the ministers, for the leaders of the churches, knowing who to turn to, knowing where to direct people to is really important. And Yeah, I can think of a couple of examples just in the last few weeks where the minister has said to me, "Oh, you need to talk to this person because they've got some questions." As new people are coming to faith, as people are wrestling with things, someone's saying, "Oh, well, I'm fine, but my husband, he's a very big believer in science. What can I say to him?" So questions like these that actually it's far more relational. You don't need it preached from the front. You need to have somebody to go and have a chat to. And that's where I think training up scientists is really key. There was the program Scientists and Congregations was up here about a decade ago. I was involved in it, and the aim was to get scientists to talk to their congregations, to talk about being a scientist, and to be one of these people that people can come to with questions. Because for most people, it's not at the forefront of their mind, but for some people, it is a really big issue. And I think particularly, we, at least in our church, have a lot of young people who are very inspired by science. And it's important for them to see that through the eyes of their faith. And to see, when I'm doing science, that's God's creation we're looking at. So the more we can inspire, the better as well.
Thank you. These are just some rather unformed thoughts, just to say something a bit different to what's already been said, which, of course, very, very helpful to hear. I think the COVID pandemic was a pretty important watershed in the way that the church, and I'm thinking, because I don't like you saying the church, the Anglican churches in particular, because those are the ones I'm familiar with, the way they relate to science. Because, I mean, you'll all remember it well. What a terrible period of history for all of us. And I remember the early weeks of the first lockdown very well. Everyone was terrified. The scientists seemed to have no idea at the time about what to do, getting all this conflicting advice. And yet within, was it 9 months? There were vaccines coming out. That was the miracle. Scientists doing their thing. And wow, we were told that it could take 10 years, but in fact it was about 9 months. Incredible. And the church leaders were, throughout this, were really rather unimpressive, I think, because they simply weren't trained to know how to relate to science and how to try to translate it to people who were experiencing, just like we all were, very human worries about the future and life and death and things like that. And I felt that was a time which showed a real failing in the church and the way in which the churches train their ministers without enough science. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, I'd just be interested to know, do any churches have scientists in, official roles in the same way, like a poet laureate or like Scotland's got a national astronomer? Do churches have scientists?
I think I've heard of some dioceses in England that have a kind of science missioner, but it's only like a handful of examples. So it would be nice if they could have a science advisor in every diocese or something.
Thank you. Yes, it's very token. So even the issue of training Anglican ministers, trainees, any science, it's pretty hard getting it into the curriculum because it isn't seen as being very important compared with, heavy-duty theology.
I think ECLAS, Equipping Christian Leaders in the Age of Science, has done an excellent job in getting quite a few seminaries and theological colleges training ministers to adopt a module in science and faith. And some of them have even become compulsory modules. It's up to the college itself to decide, but the fact they were able to get that into an already crowded curriculum was a step in the right direction. So there's progress being made, and it'd be great if we can build upon that. In my own experience in my own church, we've just started a month of outreach with a picture of a cow going moo, okay, M-O-O, month of outreach. But the interesting thing was the first thing they wanted in that series of talks was a talk on science and faith, because they wanted to clear the ground, okay? They wanted to be right up front and say, look, this isn't a big issue. Science and faith are go quite happily, and so I got asked to kick that series off. So, and I think that can be repeated elsewhere if churches want to have outreaches like that and have an element of addressing the science issue. Christians in Science can provide speakers to do that.
So yeah, we're picking up on the thread of kind of how to get this as more of a priority in front of churches, or less maybe more of a priority, but more part of the discussion and the dialogue to show the value and the use of science within a church context, not necessarily just on apologetics or theological teaching. What are the areas you think that science can contribute to in church teaching? So we have the usual big bangers like the Big Bang and evolution, but actually what are the kind of more urgent, more practical areas that we can be talking about?
Well, I think it's important as scientists that we can help congregations understand the science relating to ethical and moral questions like abortion, end-of-life care, human enhancements, things that people are often misinformed about the science. For example, in vaccine hesitancy, there was a lot of rumours basically going around that the vaccine was derived from human embryos. Now, there was a grain of truth in that, of course, because the original strain of cells that were used to culture the vaccines way back 50 years ago started with an aborted fetus. But the generations of cells cultivated from that, and nowadays they don't use those cells anymore. There's no human embryonic tissue in the vaccine. But that was used as a scientific argument for not having a vaccine because it's a moral issue. Then you're justifying abortion. But the science probably understood, said no, that's not true. Modern vaccines do not use embryonic tissue. So it's important that we're able to explain these issues to people. Okay.
Yeah, and I think the other probably big hitter at the moment would be climate change, would be another big one. And spanning from that, vaccines, even outside the COVID vaccine, other vaccines have previously been in the news and caused a lot of conflict in particular, where one or few scientists have made a statement about something and then it's been picked up by the media and taken off. The one that immediately springs to mind is the MMR and autism. And I think although that's now been proven not to be true, as is often the case when these headlines come out, they're on page 1, and then when the retraction comes out, it's on like page 15. So I think some of it, again, is where that science communication is very important. And I think not just hitting these big hot topics, but also making it accessible to people perhaps aren't always from a scientific background. Science can often be quite challenging. Like we were talking about this earlier when we're comparing biology and physics, and how often even the language that we use can be difficult for people. And I think bearing that in mind and including accessibility within that could be somewhere where the church in particular could really help.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to draw the distinction between what the local church can do and what the wider church can do, because the local church is not going to have experts in many, many fields. And I think the most important thing we can do to help the local church is show them where they can look. Teach them, because you can't give all the answers, but if they know where they can look, if they know how to find information, then that really helps. So if you're a pastor or a minister and someone comes to you with a question, you know where to look for it. I think as a scientist in a local church, the main thing for me is just that sense of awe and wonder, looking at God's creation, particularly working with children and getting that in from the beginning, that when you look at science, you look at God's creation, but also for adults, just not thinking always about the tricky things, but just looking and going, wow, that's amazing. I know who made that. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Awe and wonder. I mean, this is clearly something that science majors on, particularly with relationship to faith. So often, though, it's, stars that we see, rather than, I don't know, chemistry of benzene or something like that. I do occasionally hear people working in my own area in condensed matter physics who can do the kind of, I'm a Christian and I love the fact that I work on heavy fermions and I can tell you all about the glories of God from the kind of blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And I think, wow, this is incredible. the people who are also able to translate that into terms that ordinary people can understand who don't have that training, that is such an amazing skill. And some of these people sort of travel the country doing this. I think scientists who are Christians, it would be a great skill to learn, because you can often communicate massive enthusiasm for science simply by talking in enthusiastic terms about why you do what you do and what you think you're doing in glimpsing the divine mysteries. So, yeah, I think scientists should give talks about what they do, however mundane it might seem.
So just as we're closing, I'd like each of you, if possible, off the top of your heads, to recommend one resource, a book or a website or a film that you think everyone who wants to do good dialoguing about science and faith should be aware of. Maybe a book that's inspired you or something you read somewhere. Could even be a book you've written yourself.
I'll start off. So one of the actual places that actually got me first into my PhD and actually led me into that area, particularly as a Christian moving into science and not really being from an academic background or anything like that, and being like, actually, I'm interested in learning, I want to study more, and then that leading me off into PhD and then research and an academic career. And that was actually the organization Christians in Science, and their resources and interacting with them, and through them meeting up with fellow Christians in an organization called God and the Big Bang, which goes into schools and talks to kids about science and faith. And for me, their activities and their resources helped to not only make me better at my science, but more importantly, helped me to reconcile some of these areas where previously I had seen conflicts myself, but then actually helped me move through them and actually see more of those collaborative elements. So a lot of like the resources you saw on the screen at the start, and through just interacting with actual human people, not just the text, but actually people who live and work science, faith together.
I'm not going to be much help because I can't remember the name of the author or the book. But there's an organization called Biologos in the States, and it's one of the ladies who's very involved in that, but I can't remember the name, sorry, but it's this fantastic book that goes through the conflict points, particularly on the evolution and the creation, and goes through a whole range of different viewpoints and ideas, and just gives the plus and the minus, the strong, the weaknesses and the strength of each one. And I never realized there were so many different possibilities of interpretations of Adam and Eve. And I'm not a great reader of theology, I'm afraid. I'm not. I'm much more practical, pastoral person. But just to have it written really concisely, here's one opinion, here's another opinion, here's another opinion, here's a fourth opinion, in 6 or 7 pages was just really helpful for me when talking to people, because then I can understand where they're coming from and say, well, okay, so you don't agree with that one, but then there's this opinion as well, and this one. Just knowing that there are so many different opinions out there of the difficult questions was really helpful without having to wade through academic stuff, because I'm not a great reader.
Thank you. Yes, I can recommend a book by a very good friend of mine who died recently of cancer, Tom McLeish. You may well have heard of him. He wrote a book in 2014 called Faith and Wisdom in Science. And was a condensed matter physicist, and saw him give talks many, many times where he would intersperse the content of the talk with pictures of molecules and things like that, and talk about kind of, his awe and wonder at the physics of proteins and molecules and protein folding and things like that. And it was, of course, his enthusiasm was absolutely palpable. And he would often, almost invariably actually, go into the book of Job and kind of talk very eloquently about particularly passages like where God speaks out of the whirlwind to Job, and he says, when scientists read this, they absolutely come alive because it's talking about real science and real nature. Anyway, he would the book is quite difficult to, it's structured in a sort of almost like a series of vignettes which kind of explode upon you. But it's absolutely full of this awe and wonder, together with some, pretty chunky engagement with the Book of Job. So yeah, Faith and Wisdom in Science by Tom McLeish.
I think I've already mentioned the book that I read recently. It's written from a Jewish perspective by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who died recently. The Great Partnership. Absolutely wonderful book, and it has recommendations from people who are not believers, who were impressed by the cogency of the arguments. And it's helpful for us as Christians to see this issue from a Jewish perspective as well, and their understanding of particularly the Old Testament and how they see the harmony, because it's never been anything like the problem within Judaism as it is within Christianity, this science conflict idea. And he's very sympathetic and appreciative of the contribution of Christianity to the progress of science. So it's an excellent book. So The Great Partnership by Jonathan Sachs.
Thank you all. I think that point of reading beyond our own immediate spheres is really, really helpful, because we'll be arrogant to assume we have everything tied down and buttoned down, especially when science and technology continue to develop and continue to introduce new ideas that we have to wrestle with afresh each day. So I think tonight, what I'm going to take away is, I think Mark's point about these questions that get asked about science and faith in the church, but they're not necessarily science and faith questions, but science and faith has been hooked onto them as a way of discussing them, and being more aware of that. Emily's point about the kind of methodology almost of science and religion, and how we work through questions in science and religion, being remarkably similar. And maybe that's something that we can put across to people in our churches. So they don't have to be afraid of not just science, but the method of science and the way of doing science, and show them that it's actually something that they're already familiar with from other areas in their lives. And then from Rachel and Paul, we've both had kind of talk of trust being key to this dialogue as well, and like helping people who are not scientists and not familiar with science, but have read in the newspapers fears about vaccines, climate change running out of control. Fear is an increasingly big problem for these people. So to introduce people who they can trust, who can reassure them, while still being realistic about the scope of problems, I think that's a powerful way that we as scientists can help the church. So can we have a final round of applause for our brave speakers?